My name is Paulo Di Maria. I'm the president and CEO of the National Association of State Boards of Education. Welcome to this day's learning session in our continuing series of learning sessions on assessment and accountability that NASBE is doing in cooperation with the Center for Assessment. Today's session is about assessment innovation. And if you recall back during our previous sessions, we talked about the usefulness, how to make sure that assessments are useful in the way that they're structured and deployed, and the different types of assessments. And we also talked about the manner in which assessments can be used specifically by schools and districts in the interest of improvement. Today's topic is one that's near and dear to my heart because I think this country has been engaged in assessing students for a long period of time. And a lot of people continue to explore the idea, is there a better way? Is there a different way? Is there an innovative way? And so the focus of today's conversation is exactly that, innovation and assessment. And once again, we have an amazing team from the Center for Assessment at our joining us in partnership to present their perspective. They, by virtue of the way their center's mission is defined, focus on this issue across the country and keep their finger on the pulse of great developments, great thinking, great research that's happening in the assessment arena. So with that, I'm not going to leave it any longer. We've got Scott Marion, who's the president and executive director. He's joined by Carla Evans, who's the senior associate, who will be doing the presenting along with Scott. And we're also joined by two other staffers, Chris Donalewski, who's the associate director, and Catherine Gerwitz, who is part of their communications infrastructure. So with that, Scott, take it away. We're excited about today's topic.
Thanks so much, Paulo. And I'm pleased to see in the chat or in the participants list some familiar names and faces. I see Diana Clapp, not from Montana, but from Wyoming, close. And Diana and I have probably designed 5 different assessment systems together through the many years in Wyoming. So welcome, Diana. So let's go to the overview slide, Carla. So what we're talking about today, as Paulo said, a lot of people are talking and throwing around the terms innovation, almost like they're trying on a new pair of pants. And it really has become a catchphrase for how do we think about doing things differently and doing them at scale so that we can bring about the kind of changes we'd like to see in whether it's an assessment system, a learning system, curriculum, whatever it might be. In our case, we're really talking about assessment today, and we could actually have another conversation about accountability innovation as well. We at the Center for Assessment, and we'll show a picture later on just as a little preview of a theory of action from this Montana work that Paulo mentioned that is part of their waiver. And so we're going to talk about the whole process of innovation, what we think are important tools to help people think through innovation, and then we'll do a little case study. ThreeYear assessments have become quite popular and become widely spread across the country. There's probably, it depends how you count, anywhere from 10 to 13 states involved in some way, shape, or form. So we think that's a good case study to talk about innovation. And then we'll also talk about why is it so hard to do this successfully. By success, we mean at scale in a way that's sustainable. So let's go to the next slide. So we really talked about this, right? Everybody seems in that we have to innovate. And we actually challenged ourselves with this a few years ago and had a whole conference on innovation and really dug into what does it really mean to innovate. And if you think about, right, we all have our devices, phones, right? The iPhone, or even actually before that, those of us old enough, I can't remember what's the precursor. So bad. But iPhone. What's that?
BlackBerry.
Never mind.
Blackberries.
BlackBerry. Thank you. I thought it was so cool when I got a BlackBerry, right? And everybody thought that was like the innovation. And then you saw what happened when iPhones came into being, that iPhones really just, wiped the floor with every other potential device out there. And so what did they do? They really changed the ways in which people live and work, and many of us would argue for the worse, but oftentimes for the better. And they did it at scale, and then changed a lot of other things. Think about it, there was no such thing as app developers or things like that. So had this radical change throughout. So innovation isn't just sort of changing something that, I want to switch from blue to green, change the color of paint on this wall. It really is a serious transformation. We're going to talk about how to go about that. And so one of the things we're going to talk about, like I said, it's really part of educational assessment. There's a provision in the law that Montana is applying for. That's not what they got the waiver for, but but there are several states involved. This thing called the Innovative Demonstration Authority, or IADA for short. It's a provision that allows states to try out new ideas in assessment. And the big advantage, the main advantage in my mind of the IADA, is it allows states to try out something new in a subset of their school districts. So your current law requires you to use the same assessment for every kid in every school district, and the IADA allows you to try something out in a subset of your districts. Eventually, you have to scale it up to the full state, or abandon the innovation, or abandon the new assessment system. So that's the IADA. So innovation is even in the law. Let's go to the next slide, Carla. So there's lots of ways of thinking about innovation, whether it's design thinking, or folks familiar with the D school, the design school at Stanford. There's but generally whether you start with empathy, which is something that is emphasized, and something we've adopted. It's emphasized as part of the Stanford process, this notion of first really understanding the problem from the perspectives of those who feel the ill effects of the current system the most, and who really are closest, that the language they use is those most proximate to the problem. And so it's really understanding the nature of the problem, and then trying to, some people talk about it, are more familiar with this type of work as root cause analysis and things like that, to try to get really clear about it. What we see very often, and we're working on a design process right now in another state, is people, just because of the way we are, rush to this ideate, or the idea phase. We want to spit out ideas because we're trying to solve the problem as fast as we can, and we often do that before we really understand the problem. And so we're not going to walk you through every phase of this here. We're just going to talk about another simple way of looking at this. Go to the next slide, if you will. We'll talk about one model that we so first, like I said, is you really need to understand the problem. And so that's this discovery, often through empathy. You have to develop plans and some hypotheses about what you think could actually start solving the problem. And then you have to build prototypes. If you're doing something really innovative, I don't know that you could do it at scale right away. I did have a conversation with Michael Fullen a few years ago, and he said he was giving up on what did he say? He was giving up on reform. He's going for social movements, is what he told me. He's thinking about like Arab Spring and things like that. He said I don't care if they do it, implement it faithfully. I just want widespread movements. I haven't seen the fruits of his efforts there, but I always appreciate his thinking. But so then we have this notion of prototyping, testing things out to make sure they work. And one of the innovative assessment states, Massachusetts, I think, is doing a really good job with their system, as opposed to just trying to scale slowly, little by little each year, and increase the number of districts. They're really trying to refine their design with pretty much the same number of districts until they feel like they could pull the plug and go statewide. And then eventually you need to scale it. You need to have it widespread and have it adopted. Right, we all are familiar with the notion of early adopters and later adopters. Let's go to the next slide. We're not going to spend so much time on this now, but you notice in this understanding stage, this is where this notion of a theory of action comes in. And we'll come back to theory of action, but this is something that we use as a tool to help us both understand the problem, understand how we could start addressing the problem, and then it can serve as a framework for helping us to evaluate the extent to which we're actually making any progress in solving the problem. So I want you guys to take a second, go to the next slide, Carla, and just think about, a problem, an issue, a challenge that you're trying to solve or fix or address with your statewide assessment system. It could be a big thing. It says, well, I don't think it's serving the intended purposes. That's a big thing. Or micro level that we want to get the reports back quicker, or something like that. So think about a problem, take a second. It will give you just a couple of minutes to type your problems into the chat. Give us something to talk about. And we had some in there. I'm going to pull up in the meantime. I had some advanced problems. Yeah, thanks, Paula. Oh, that's Patty. That's a great one, right? That's something we actually, a lot of stories about that. That's I really like that one. That's a really important problem, actually. Somebody wrote ahead of time, the challenges of trying to assess competency-based learning systems. Right. Catherine's being a ringer and throwing in a problem that we hear a lot. That's right. Yeah, and so this is at the macro level, thinking about how a school district in their planning process would use their results. And if you don't get them back till August, it's tough to have summer planning work. Sarah writes from Arkansas. Yeah, Sarah, transitions are really hard, and we could talk a lot about communication. Alan, you're exactly right, and we can have a long talk about that. That's, in some ways, that's on purpose, but people don't like that. So returning information quicker and be able to react mid-year than the following year. Oh, Diana, Carla just wrote a blog about this one. Maybe you should post that.
I've been reading some of that.
Yeah.
I was hoping you'd touch on it today.
We were happy to touch on that. We might even have a debate about it. We'll see. So why don't we, so these are great. These are really important kinds of problems. And so let's go to the next slide, right? And this is what makes us crazy, right? It's, we can't just simply go from problem to solution like we're clicking our heels and hoping to get there. We need to think about what's the path, a yellow brick road, if you will, to get to our intended solution. So we're going to go back to this next this diagram that we talked about the theory of action, and then you could go it's really the next slide after this, and let's say a little bit about theories of action. Right, and so it's really a logical argument. You could keep clicking through these, Carla, and it's we have these goals. You have to be really clear on the goals, but then what's it going to take to get to those goals? And what would be some nearer term indicators that would tell you that you're actually making progress towards those goals? Let's just take a simple thing, right? I want to increase graduation rates. Well, I could wait until the kids get to 12th grade and see if they graduated or not. But I do know that a good leading indicator is 9th grade credit accumulation. And we have good evidence now that kids who don't accumulate enough credits in 9th grade are at the risk of falling off the graduation pathway. So I would use as a near-term indicator in that case, 9th grade credit accumulation or 9th grade failure as a way to help me understand. And so if I have kids who fail, what would be something, a process or a mechanism I would put in my theory of action that would help get these kids back on track? Oh, I need to have some credit recovery programs so these kids have a chance to, so it's not magic that I say I want to increase my graduation rate and just pray. I mean, that's an effective technique for certain things, but in this case, it's actually better to have some logic and mechanisms and processes to do that. So that's what a theory of action really helps us lay out. We could go the next slide. Actually, you could skip this one and go right to this one next. So at its simplest, we talk about what are the inputs in the process, right? What are the things that we're going to do or the system's going to do? And then what are the effects? What are the intended outcomes of those effects? So we're going to come back to this shortly. I want to just see if you have any questions about what we've done so far before I transition to Carla, because I think getting this sense of this ThreeYear assessment will help to make some of this real as this case study. But are there any questions so far? And we might have a second to respond to some of these things in the chat as well. Does anybody have any questions thus far? And just either shout them out or put them in the chat. But so you know, just very quickly, for Sarah's point about the transition in Arkansas, I mean, it becomes a problem if you don't attend to it. It's, you know, you obviously transition because you thought you had or somebody thought you had a problem using ACT Aspire. And so now with this new system, this is not a theory of action mechanism, but people, we often let psychometricians write communications vehicles, and that's the worst thing you could do. And what I often ask people is, like, they say, well, we showed it to a bunch of people and they didn't hate it, or they say they even liked it. And what I often will do with folks, if I'm showing them a communications device, whether it's a student report or a class report, I'll ask them to interpret it for me like I'm another teacher, I'm a parent. And you'll find some really different responses when you ask them. Oh, they say, oh yeah, we'd like a little more white space, as opposed to saying, oh, I have no idea what these numbers mean. So I think you can't over communicate, Sarah, and especially you will see a change in likely change in proficiency rates for no other reason that there's just differences. And how do you communicate about that? I'm sure that you folks in the state, I know you have good folks there, are doing that. Yeah, Diana, Catherine just posted in the chat Carla's recent blog on this, and
I think we should circle back to that after we talk about ThreeYear, because I think then we could talk more about performance-based assessment. I think that's
perfect.
a really, it's another case study we could talk about.
Yeah, and I think we should transition to the ThreeYear discussion, and we're actually right on time. And so I'm gonna, Carla, you get to do your own animations.
Take the reins here. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk about ThreeYear assessment as a case study of one proposed innovation, and then let's talk about others like performance-based assessments or other things that may come to your mind as you think about this one particular example. So just if you don't live in this world like we do, and you're like, what do you mean by ThreeYear assessment program? We're going to define it first. So if you think about the typical state assessment, it's administered at the end of the year. So very simply, a through year is taking that end of year and it's distributing it in some manner throughout the year. So you still might have something very small at the end of the year, but there's going to be other state assessment opportunities throughout the year. So we say it's administered in multiple distinct sessions during a school year, and it still produces, as you see in A here, a summative determination. So what is a student proficient or not? We're still getting the achievement level of students, since that's federally required, but there's often an additional aim. And that's why there's this innovation, because the additional aim then is tied to what the state may be trying to solve, and capturing a motivation that is not being met, or a problem that arises because of the current state assessment program, and something they're hoping to change. And there's lots of additional aims that could be. We're going to talk about a couple today. And actually, I'm going to just have you put this in the back of your mind to think about, well, what might a state, your state, we put problems, you put in the chat some of the things for Scott about like some of the things you're seeing, lack of reports that are useful. And one test at the very end of the year is what Paolo said. And Alan, you talked about formative information that's not useful for instruction. And Christine talked about wanting quicker results. And Patty talked about having better reports. So those are some reasons, but just keep that in the back of your mind, because we're going to circle back in a minute to what do you think some of the problems are that your state or other states are trying to solve. And just so you get the current landscape, we are really talking about what has bubbled up as an innovation a lot of states are exploring. So as Scott mentioned, there is about 13 who have at least considered it that we know of. Again, maybe there's others, and you might represent a state who's talked about it behind closed doors. And Georgia and Kansas have since changed and are not pursuing it. But you can see this is something that states are considering, like, is this an innovation we should pursue? So as I mentioned, there's a problem that state boards of ed, state education agencies are trying to solve when they're moving towards a through-year assessment program, or moving towards a performance-based assessment program, or whatever kinds of innovation. So we know you might not be able to get in people's heads, but when you're thinking about what might leaders be or vendors be thinking about with respect to through-year, what do you think are the problems they're trying to solve? And you can take yourself off mute, you can put it in the chat. What do you think are some of the problems being attempted to be solved here?
I'll give you a little hint. You could look back up in the chat as some of the problems are identified.
Yeah, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. There's all of those innovations that are all those reasons that people are trying to solve that. I don't know by, show of hands, I can't see everyone on my screen because there's more tiles than I can see, but like, I don't know how many of you by show of hands or just in the chat, like, yes, this is something you have heard being talked about in your state. Yeah, Laura, more closely aligning assessments with instruction. We're going to talk about that in more detail in just a minute. Alan, measure and report the growth of every individual student. Yes, some wanting to be able to embed in growth metrics within the program throughout the year, rather than districts using interim assessments that may not actually be aligned to the state standards or to the state performance expectations. Yep, problem is the need to honor a growth mindset. So there's a lot of reasons, including all the ones that you already listed earlier, that states are moving or considering or discussing this innovation. And so I'm going to just keep going because that's the slide that summed up what we already just said there. But we want to consider, and this is really one of the purposes of taking a moment, actually more than a moment, a lot of moments to think through a clear theory of action and logic model, is what could go wrong? So there's a lot that we can get excited about with through-year assessment or any assessment innovation, performance-based assessments, competency-based assessments, we could go on, but we have to ask ourselves at the very beginning, before any student sees anything, before anything has been written, what could go wrong? And so what we're going to do is try to poke some holes in through-year assessment, not completely, but we'll point to some of the things that states would want to consider and design for at the very beginning. So this, some of the slides that you're going to see come from a paper that my colleagues Nathan, Dady, Will Laurier, and myself wrote recently, just in March, where we tried to summarize 10 key considerations. So these are the things we would say, if your state is considering a 3-year assessment program, consider these 10 things. And they fall into these 3 buckets: conceptualization and design, curriculum and instruction, and logistical and technical. And I'm mentioning these because we're going to focus today on conceptualization and design a little bit, talk about some different theories of action. And then we're going to talk about curriculum and instruction and poke some holes in what could go wrong depending on the design at the very beginning. And if one of my colleagues wants to post this PDF, you could read it after. It's you're interested in more. So with respect to conceptualization and design, Scott talked about a theory of action, and another way of thinking about it is logic models. But we have to ask ourselves, is our design for this assessment program actually going to address these problems we want it to solve? And so in doing so, what we thought we would do is share a hypothetical example and then actually share Montana's example. So this hypothetical example, which isn't too far off from some that we've seen, is a very high level theory of action and for a 3-year assessment program. And so if the state provides assessment scores, so you can see in this particular design, it would be fall, winter, and spring. And if the state provides training, so how would you use this information you're now getting multiple times a year? Then the thought is, well, educators will adjust their instruction to meet the needs of students. So you can see the aim of this particular 3-year assessment program is to have more instructionally useful information come from the state assessment. And then educators will look at that information they get within the year. So they're actually going to do something different, maybe allocate additional support, change resources, do something with that information so that the ultimate goal being students' achievement improves. But I'm sure you're like, wow, there's a big jumps between providing scores and some training, and then educators changing their instruction, administrators actually being able to make within year adjustments, and student learning and achievement improving. Like, there's a lot of assumptions underneath all of these boxes. And the devil's in the details when we talk about most things in life, right? Including assessment program design. So we need more detail. And on the next slide, we're going to show you a more detailed theory of action that still has assumptions, and we'll talk about those. It's from Montana's 3-year modular system. So this isn't, we're not going to talk all about what Montana's is, but they break up the content over the year into chunks. So if you think about math, it's like fractions, multi-digit multiplication, so it's a different kind of 3-year design. And what I want to point out in sharing this is I want to focus just on the top part. And this is like one part of a larger report. So it's a little bit too much to take in. So we thought, well, just take this one part that's really focusing on that the 3-year assessment, this aim that their program is going to provide instructionally useful information. So that's the problem they're trying to solve, right? They think that the state assessment as it currently is not providing instructionally useful information. I'm sure there's other things as well in Montana they're trying to solve, but let's just focus on this one. So then you see in their theory of action, they're specifying, okay, well, if we have these conditions, then we have score reports. So we're going to make our score reports, going to Patty's point, we're going to make them better. We're going to have them more clearly indicate student strengths and needs, class strengths and needs. And if we do that, and we deliver them in a timely way so they can act, then we expect these particular uses of the score reports and actions that teachers and leaders are going to engage in professional learning. They're going to have time together to collaborate, interpret, and use it. And teachers and students are going to get some sort of feedback from these score reports that they can use to change something instructionally, change learning actions. So you can see then they have these short-term outcomes that teacher practices are going to change. You're going to see more differentiation. Students are going to be able to be more capable to use feedback. And then their ultimate goal here is student engagement and learning improve. So we could say, wow, this is much more specified, yet there's still a lot of jumps and assumptions and things that would need to be spelled out and maybe spelled out in the rest of this report that I just don't remember because I didn't work on this project, but that say like exactly what are the mechanisms and ways in which our design is going to meet these needs. Scott, I
Yeah,
see.
Carla, I passed
Yeah.
it. I posted the link to the full report,
Perfect.
and what it has is this overview, but then there's like 4 layers of each of these components blown out in their own theory of action, because they're really using it to guide design and evaluation.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And so what this example shows is when you're going towards any assessment innovation or any innovation, right, we have to really dig into the details and the assumptions we believe must hold. So then the question I want to still ask is, okay, what could go wrong? So now taking it out of Montana. So we're not going to read through Montana's report carefully and go through the 4 layers. So they may already have this, but in general, right, if we think about any through-year assessment program, I'm going to just talk about 2 things that could go wrong when instructional use, having something that provides teachers with more instructional useful information. What could go wrong? What is it that they would really want to think through? You as a leader, state education agency leaders, what would you want to think through in the design phase to plan for if that is the aim, the additional aim? So first off is that the 3-year assessment program could reduce local control over curriculum. And so when you think about distributing, and I'm going to give a more pointed example here in a minute, distributing the state assessment throughout the year, right away you think, oh, well, there could be this interaction effect of typically local education agencies decide what they teach, how they teach it, when they teach it, as long as by the end of the school year, the content has been taught, and so students take the state assessment. But if we're distributing it throughout the year, then obviously curriculum pacing, scope and sequencing that was under total local control can be somewhat reduced. So let me give you an example to ground this. So this is grade 4 math. I used to teach grade 4, so I always love to use grade 4 as an example. I'm like, I understand grade 4. That's what I know. So the first example at the top is from Illustrative Mathematics, which is an open source math curriculum. And in grade 4 math, it's divided into 9 units. I didn't make this up. And the second example is from Eureka or Engage New York, and they divide grade 4 math into 7 units. And so what the point here is, you could imagine a district doing all the due diligence and looking at the state assessment blueprint, looking at the priority standards if they exist, thinking through the big ideas and the most important content in the grade level, and saying to teachers, if they teach using Illustrative, we want you to have taught through unit 6 before the state assessment at the end of the year. And similarly for Engage New York, maybe they say we want you to teach through unit 5 or something like that. So the district made these decisions based on all the information they had. They want the students to have the most equitable opportunities to learn and to showcase all that they know and can do by the time that they're tested. So if everything works out perfectly, then you have this beautiful green line of the state test and students had the best opportunity to learn. And so now imagine, if you would with me, that the state test is distributed throughout the year. We have this through-year assessment program. So if that happens, then there's a, depending on how the 3-year assessment is designed and what's in that assessment, there can be implications on what is taught and when it's taught. So I'll ground this even more. So think about curriculum 1. Curriculum 1, students don't learn how to multiply and divide multi-digit numbers until unit 6. Whereas in Eureka, they do that in unit 3. So if you know anything about grade 4 math, multiplying and dividing multi-digit numbers is a big idea. That's a big thing in grade 4 math. Like, that's a really important part. So what happens then if the beginning, the first green line, or the mid-year 3-year assessment session has multi-digit multiplication on it? So what changes would the district feel like they have to make to their normal curriculum and instructional implementation, given that they're not covering it until different time periods? And the bigger question is, does that actually benefit student learning? Just moving around content willy-nilly in order to, meet the state assessment needs because it's now been distributed throughout the year, is that actually best for student learning? So it just opens this question And so states then have to grapple with, how are we going to distribute the content throughout the year if we're doing that as part of a 3-year program? Okay, lastly, another thing that can go wrong, and one of the assumptions that would have to be met, is that a state assessment could ever provide this direct formative information that could be used to change what teachers and students are doing on a daily or weekly basis. Because right now, state tests are just not designed for that purpose. So think with me for a minute about what information we get back on those reports that we just talked about. You know, teachers get scaled scores, achievement levels, sub-scores, they might get other quantitative information. So if that's what they're typically getting, then are we expecting some sort of miracle? Notice I'm hand waving here to sort of occur, because all of a sudden they're supposed to use those quantitative results to make qualitative changes in their instruction. But they don't know how, you know, where are students struggling exactly? Why are they struggling? How does that relate to my curriculum? And they don't have the qualitative information they need to understand what students are thinking, what misconceptions they might have. They just have these quantitative scores. And so without these changes in the way states tests are currently designed, then it just doesn't add up, right? No pun intended with all the math on the board there. It just, the state has to design for this kind of problem if they want the additional aim to be instructional utility. And with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Scott.
Yeah, and see, Lauren had to leave. I actually know some of the stuff she's working on, these targets in the strategic plan. Also a challenge. So, you know, so why is this so hard? A lot of people, you know, put things in the chat that why can't we do this, or this is what we'd like to solve for. And it does sound like we should be able to do this. And this is something we started out with our very first webinar, is that one of the sad truths, if you will, in our field is that it's really hard for assessments to do more than one thing well. Maybe they could do 2 closely related things well, but to have an assessment that you need for monitoring the long-term educational trends of these aggregate entities, schools, districts, states, you need a certain type of information, and you don't want to be collecting that information every day because it would be a huge burden for everyone. So we say once a year is enough, maybe in case of NAEP, every couple of years is enough. But when we want information to improve student learning, I need that information. If I'm closest to student learning, I need it. I need a lot of it. And, you know, I used to joke, Diana, remember this, the last thing you want is me as a state assessment director assessing kids every day. You know, poor kids and, you know, poor teachers who in between that, because that would be, I don't know what those kids need and what the contexts are and what, you know, what they just learned and what they need to learn coming up. So, so that's one of the things that makes this so hard, is that we have some limitations in what we could do with these tools. So there's I just want to turn to this before we get to the next slide. Would through-year assessment take away more teaching time? You know, it doesn't have to be true by definition, but every model that I've seen requires more total time than the current end-of-year model. Now, the thought, and this is again where Carla, you know, had the what could go wrong. The thought is that if people use the through-year, they might get rid of some of their commercial interim assessments like Renaissance Star or iReady or NWA Map or things like that. We haven't seen that happen yet. District leaders are reluctant to get rid of those things. So right now, the current through-year model, doesn't mean it have to be that way. Current through-year models take more time than an end-of-year test. But yeah, keep those questions coming. So let's go to the next slide. So, you know, we've, because we like to put things in categories, you know, thinking about why is this so hard? What are our design challenges? So it starts right away with thoughtful design and that use of a theory of action or other tools to really articulate the design, that it represents the needs of stakeholders well, that it actually is based in the literature, or best practice, what we know. You know, I just got cited this, somebody just got this notice that this paper was cited, first paper I ever wrote in this field in 1989. Yes, I'm old. That and it was actually the days when you used to actually go to libraries. Remember those things? And I was doing the literature review for this paper, and I came back from the library. I was so excited. I told my boss, I said, "Look at all the stuff I found on class size." He says, "Yeah, you could learn a lot by going to the library." And you know, and I've always thought about that, because we tend to design things like we just landed on this planet and nobody's ever come before us, and nobody's ever tried this stuff. And so there's been a lot of work. There's been a lot of smart people thinking about this. So you have to understand and be much more empathetic with the stakeholders you're trying to design for, but you also need to look at, if nobody has ever been able to do the thing you're trying to do and there's been 100 tries, maybe you could do it, but I just want to know that why you think you've built a better mousetrap, and what you might want to do differently. So design is really the heart of it. The technical stuff, and we'll say, you know, we like to think we're pretty good at figuring that stuff out, but you have to still attend to a lot of these technical details because they come back to bite you. The thing that we're seeing on ThreeYear, it's both these bottom two boxes, the policy and resources and the culture and capacity. So somebody just asked, will it take more time? I think it'll take more time. It'll likely cost more. Now you're not just administering one assessment a year, you could be administering 4, 5, 6, even more than that. And so it's always an effort at a Department of Education when a state assessment is going on. And what are the policy requirements? Carla talked about curriculum. Well, if we want to have a really tight through-year system, in our view, it would require maybe a little less local control over curriculum. That's a fun fight to have as a state leader. And so Diana could tell you, I tried that in Wyoming a few times. I got laughed out of the room. So that's the policy stuff needs to be lined up with this. The culture and capacity, we're asking locals to do more stuff than they're already doing, and just administering the tests we hand them. We're asking them now to take this information and interpret it in a way that's going to be useful to kids and useful to them as educators. And we haven't always built I shouldn't say haven't always, we rarely build the capacity necessary to do that. We have to attend to that in these kind of innovations. And then structure, you know, we say this a lot, and there's some efforts to move away from this, but we still run schools like we're all farmers. And the same calendar, the same conceptualization of how school should be, that we're farmers and kids are in factories and they're moving along. And so we haven't, you know, we've toyed around with different structures for personalized and competency-based learning, but rarely do you see these structures change. And structure and culture go really closely together. So these are things that you just can't say, well, if we just switch and get a new assessment vendor, it'll all be better. Because if you don't attend to all these things, it's gonna be hard to get better. I'm talking a little too long. Let's go to the next slides. And then we just break this out. I don't have to go through all this, right? You have to think about all these issues. Are they worth scaling? Like I said, we're pretty good at the technical stuff. We could figure that out. I've already talked about these policy ones. Let's go to the next slide. And you know, that's the big thing, right? Is budgets. How do we allocate budgets differently to make this work happen? All right, let's go to the next slide, and we're going to wrap up. So this is something that that we've seen. People want some radical innovations, but the more radical the innovation generally, the harder it is to scale. Now, you might say, well, you just talked about iPhones. That was pretty radical innovation, and they did scale. It has to be that, you know, appealing and that useful and that sort of even aesthetically pleasing, right? All these things worked in the iPhone's favor. And we had the computer technology in the background, the bandwidth and things like that, and the cellular services started to make it happen. A lot of things had to come together to make that innovation work. You could imagine they could have invented an iPhone, but if people couldn't keep connected, they would have gotten rid of it and just gone back to landlines. So a lot of things had to fall into place. But so generally, the more ambitious the innovation, especially when we're talking about education innovations, the harder it is to scale. And we're not saying you shouldn't be ambitious. We think you should be ambitious, but you have to then attend to the other things that we're talking about and be willing to make some big changes and not try to make little changes and hope to get, big transformations. So, and Paula just put a good thing in we live in the world of trade-offs. If you want to get A, you might have to sacrifice some of B, maybe some of C. So we want you to aim high, but we also want you to don't fall off the cliff. So, right. So we talked a lot. You guys had some great stuff in the chat. We still have 12 minutes or 10 minutes for questions and comments and other thoughts you guys all might have.
And also any update, are interesting things going on in your state that maybe you'd like the rest of the group to know about. We always welcome those kinds of observations, especially, if your board is doing the considering and you've heard a number of questions come up and you want to put those before the group or before Scott and his team.
These assumptions, and then how could you design a 3-year assessment program if you were a state that had a lot of stakeholders interested in that could potentially work around some of those issues that you're bringing up. And so there's different approaches, and I think the biggest is the grain size of the assessment being administered. And so right now, the end of the year test is over a sample of overall the content, right? But you could imagine a state could say, well, we're going to provide 20 opportunities and we're going to chunk up the content into really small little bits. And so we're going to allow teachers maybe choose when they administer those assessments, and they're going to be state assessments, but we're going to try to do that so that we could get the results right back to teachers and maybe they could do something with it. So there's assumptions then made about teachers still, can they take in all that information, and what kind of information would they get back? Are they seeing student work? Are they just seeing a number, a percentage? Are they seeing what they selected? So there's ways that I think states and different states are trying to approach it. Right now, we see two main buckets. We see some states who are doing all content standards at every administration, because if you don't, then students don't necessarily have an equitable opportunity to learn and demonstrate that they are learning throughout the year. And there's other technical issues and logistical issues, and then other states who are modularizing it, and I'll use that term, which is what Montana is doing, and others that are chunking up the content. And does it really address your key issue? I don't think we know enough to say it does. The research is just not there yet, but I think we could make some guesses based on what we know from formative assessment literature and interim assessment. What's the likelihood that teachers are going to be able to take that up and actually go back, to your point?
Montana is trying to allow a lot of flexibility. The challenge, Carla just pointed out that little 4th grade math example. And folks at Student Achievement Partners just did an analysis of the 5 most common math curriculum. And what Carla showed is actually closer than what they were seeing, even when you look at these 5 common curriculum. So it's really hard to say that. So then your question is, if I'm in a district and I'm using, one version of math, and I want to assess a unit on fractions that I just taught, can I pull down the fractions module that administered that? You're right, Diana, it does raise security issues, and it's worth asking, is that the best way to get instructionally useful information? But the challenge, of course, then people worry about is comparability. I'm willing to forego some comparability. We just have to make sure the scores mean with they say they mean. And so one of the waiver, if you will, in Montana, so it's like a 1-year IADA is really what it is. They're allowing these districts that are participating in the pilot to forego using smarter balance in those at the end of the year. But what we're asking them to do, so they're not crazy about this, is to administer basically a full new test, not in a modular form at the end of the year, so we could try to get a stable scale. So you always have to give a little bit. You never get all you want. So that's what's going on there.
Yeah.
So that's the ideal.
The only example we have that's a little bit different right now is Louisiana, because they have more buy-in with their ELA curriculum. So like 80% of their school systems use what they call ELA guidebooks, which is created by the state and it's freely offered, but the districts have just adopted it, their school systems. So their innovative assessment pilot is really curriculum embedded more, or curriculum relevant, because they have so much adoption. They have such a high adoption rate. But you can imagine across states, and I know Wyoming, you like don't even have an office of curriculum lady, and you're just like, state does not touch curriculum. So it's like, is that going to work in other contexts where you don't have this concentration of curriculum? I just don't see it happening. And in Louisiana, in math, social studies, and science, where they're also trying to do innovative pilots, they're not doing the same model because they can't. They have so much dispersion of curriculum that it makes it difficult.
Do you want to address, unless Paula's got something, Diana's question about performance-based assessment?
Yeah, I mean, that's another innovation, right, Diana, that states could consider. And as Catherine put my blog in here, I think that one of the constraints around that, or the tensions, like you have to, if you get A, what do you trade off, is one of the challenges is we can't just give students one performance assessment and really get a stable, reliable estimate of what they know and can do. So the amount we would have to give them, if we have to give every student every year an individual achievement level, is high. And so there's reasons in the accountability space we could get a little bit more flexibility, like maybe you don't have to test every student every year, you do it once a grade span, and maybe you don't have to, you could do some school level reporting. Then I think it opens up flexibilities. But I think there has been interest. New Hampshire had an innovative assessment pilot around performance-based assessments that many of us at the center worked on. And it took a lot of time and energy, but those educators who were part of it felt like it was the right time and energy. So again, I think it's the state's interested in that. It's how do we design to really get us and address the problem we're trying to address, and work out all the assumptions that have to hold.
What's the current status of New Hampshire?
They killed it. And the reason why, you wouldn't believe the psychometric gymnastics that we had to do to actually make that work, because it was not meant to be a statewide assessment the way it was designed. And we tried to actually offer the districts a more hybridized model. They didn't want to give up their vision, but we told them it's not going to fly as an accountability test. And so, yeah.
That was high on the local control. There was only one thing in common, and that was one performance assessment across like a grade and content area. The rest was all local assessment information. So that's what was challenging, like there was very little in common to establish comparability. So if we could, if you could think about a different kind of a model where there's a little bit more in common or more agreement amongst school districts, but that's hard too. Live free or die is the New Hampshire state motto. So
There you go. All right, very good. Listen, thank you so very much. Why don't we give our presenters a big round of applause?
Thank you guys all. Great interaction.
Thanks all the rest of you for joining us. A couple of just reminders. First of all, this was the third of 4 learning sessions. Our next learning session will be September 28th at 3 o'clock Eastern time. It will focus on test fairness and accessibility, 2 other topics that really surface, especially in the interest of making sure that we're giving all students and each student the opportunity to demonstrate what they know and are able to do.